Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your host, Diehl. I'm currently the president of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. On this morning's show, we're going to talk about the importance of energy independence. And here to talk about this very relevant and important topic, I do have three distinguished guests. And I'd like each of you just to very briefly give an introduction of yourself, what you do, and why this particular topic is important to you.
My name is Ben Rogers, and I'm chair this year of the Linn County Board of Supervisors, a role that I've been in since 2009. And the issue of energy independence is very important to our future, as well as there's a lot of applicability here at home in Linn County that I hope I get to jump into.
Thank you, Ben.
Hi, Alan. I appreciate the invitation to be part of this session. My name is Jim Martin-Schramm. I'm a professor emeritus at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. I spent most of my career working on topics related to ethics and public policy, with a lot of work in energy and climate policy. I've taught courses at Luther about U.S. energy policy and in Germany and the UK on the energy transition in the European Union. I've also been very involved in renewable energy projects at Luther College and here in Winneshiek County, and been engaged in public policy about this topic in the state of Iowa.
Thank you.
Hello, Alan. My name's Tyler Priest. Pleasure to be on the program. I'm an associate professor of history and geography at the University of Iowa. I study the history of the oil and gas industry in all its facets. I teach U.S. energy policy here at the University of Iowa. And of course, the subject of energy independence is sort of central to both my research and teaching.
Well, again, thank you all three for joining. You each bring a unique perspective. There's certainly a lot of different angles we could approach this topic. And of course, you know, the elephant in the room here is we're discussing this a month out from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And of course, Russia being a major exporter of fossil fuels, that has once again ignited the conversation around energy independence, of course, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. And, you know, one of the things we had talked about, of course, was this isn't a new conversation. Well, you know, it's been going on for decades for a variety of reasons, and we'll hopefully get into that. But I think before we get there, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is just what does it mean to be energy independent? You kind of hear that term thrown around politically. You know, as I've had conversations with different people, there seems to be a lot of different opinions on what it means to be energy independent. So I'd like one of you that would like to take the lead on this, just talk a little bit about how we measure energy independence and what you feel it means to be energy independent. So anyone that wants to jump in.
Tyler, I think you ought to go for this.
Okay, well, you know, we can talk about energy independence. We can talk about energy security, which are slightly different, have slightly different meanings. In a technical sense, one could say that we are energy independent today, in the sense that we produce as much or even more energy than we actually consume, and the vast majority of that comes from fossil fuels. But you know, we also export a lot of oil and a lot of natural gas. We're not truly independent of the global energy system. We're embedded in it in many ways. You know, we for various reasons, even though we produce as much oil and liquid fuels as we consume, there are reasons why we export a lot of that and import oil at the same time. So, you know, we probably have greater energy security now than we ever have, and that's largely a result of the shale revolution, which is, has increased our production of crude oil and natural gas by vast amounts since, the 2000s.
I think what I would add to that, and he's laid it out very, very well. It sort of depends on which fuel you're talking about as well, right? So natural gas, because of that shale revolution and hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling technology, we've just extraordinarily increased the production of oil and gas in the United States with those two technologies. And now we do have more liquefied natural gas export capacity. But in general, all of that volume of natural gas tends to be staying around here in North America, whereas oil is a global commodity. And even if we really ratchet up a lot of our production of oil, that won't necessarily make a difference at the pump, because that oil is going to be sold in global markets, and the price is going to be based on supply and demand, and of course political shocks to the system. So it sounds good as a term, but I think it's a little more complicated than just ramping up energy independence. The other thing I'll just say about that term, and I had a conversation with a colleague about this today actually, is that he prefers to talk about it in terms of energy self-reliance and making use, in our case, we're talking about renewable energy and making use of the renewable energy resources in our state and in our communities and in our counties. And I know Ben is very much in the middle of those conversations.
Yeah, excellent. And so one of the working definitions that I saw out there, right, kind of the popular one, is around, are we a net exporter of oil? And for some time now, for roughly several years, we have been a net exporter, meaning we export more, in this case, oil, natural gas, et cetera, fossil fuels, if you will, than we do import. And they kind of track that on a rolling 12-month basis. And, you can, however you slice and dice it, you can make it look like we're an exporter and importer. But one of the thoughts is that, well, to truly be energy independent is meaning that we'll never be dependent upon another country for fossil fuels energy. And that seems to be kind of the popular idea of what energy independence is. So, and Ben, you can jump in on this, whoever would like to. But is that realistic, that we would ever even want to be, self-sustaining, if you will, produce and consume in isolation all of our energy? Maybe the pros and cons of that type of thinking that's out there.
I'm not. My field of study is not on the economics of if a country chooses a isolationist approach. But certainly the idea of and I like the term, energy self-reliance. We may achieve these objective measures of exporting more than we import. But I think something that's fundamentally missing from this conversation is our resiliency to spikes in either energy inputs, or pressure on electrical grids, are what we're seeing internationally impacting the price at the pump. And that piece of resiliency of, like my friends in New Zealand, where I grew up as a child, they're now paying almost $16 a gallon. I mean, that fundamentally changes your daily habits, your behaviors, and the decisions you make. They've had higher gas prices because they're a isolated island in the South Pacific. So of course the price will be higher, but they've also had years more experience of having to adjust and alter behaviors, invest in infrastructure that allows for greater public transportation and less cars on the road, so that people can still go about their lives and not have to make life-changing decisions about, can I fuel my car or feed my children? So I know I may have taken this on a little turn, but energy independence is certainly something we should strive to achieve for. But the thing that each and every one of us feels is our level of resilience and adaptation to the changing nature of energy costs.
I think the other thing I would add to that is, so far this conversation has been predominantly around energy independence vis-a-vis fossil fuels. And of course, we live on the same planet, and that atmosphere can only absorb so much carbon pollution or other greenhouse gases. And the reality is, if we continue to burn these fossil fuels at the rate we are nationally and other nations are internationally, we won't be talking about energy independence. We'll be lucky to be talking about resilience. We'll really be talking about civilization surviving. And that's, I think, another part of this discussion that tends to get left out of the political rhetoric about energy independence, as it takes place in this larger geochemical reality that we all live in.
Yeah, I would say that energy independence is not something I would say we should strive for as a national policy, or maybe stated in that way. It's good to build resilience, definitely, into our energy system and our consumption, and certainly renewables help to do that. Wind and solar, and decarbonizing the electric grid. I think those are all desirable objectives. Even though we, are a net exporter of crude oil and a growing exporter of natural gas, and we produce as much as we consume when we're talking about oil and gas, there's still so many connections to the global economy, and I think those connections are good. It's good to be an importer and an exporter of these resources, because it gives us more influence over what happens around the world, influence over prices. U.S. oil and gas exports now are coming to the rescue, coming to Western Europe's rescue, with the sort of uncertainty and risks that are now involved in relying for those countries in relying on Russian oil and gas. It's important to also mention that there's a lot of foreign investment in U.S. energy, in wind and solar, in oil and gas. The largest refinery in this country, in Port Arthur, Texas, is actually wholly owned by Saudi Aramco, and there are other foreign companies that are invested in our energy system. So I don't think it's a desirable goal to try to cordon ourselves off from the world when it comes to energy.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Just thinking in terms of resiliency, I think, again, some of the ideas that if we could, the global market almost in some ways exposes us to this volatility. But would you argue the opposite, that being part of a global market, energy market, oil and otherwise, although you do see the ups and downs, and obviously we've seen that recently, does it, at the end of the day, though, provide us with more stability and even resiliency? I do want to dive, Ben, more into this idea of renewables and so on and so forth. But speak to, if somebody wants to there, again, about just this idea of participating in the global market, and not only the benefits it has just from a price stability standpoint, but potentially even just the lever of economic sanctions that's out there, right, as an alternative to just direct conflict that we've seen different countries pulling here. So maybe speak a little bit to that. I know I've said threw a couple questions out there, but something
embeddedness in the global economy does expose us to more volatility, but it's kind of hard to escape that. If we want the other levers and tools that come along with that. In 2015, under the Obama administration, the Congress and Obama lifted a 40-year ban on crude oil exports that had been in place since 1975. And I would say that had we not lifted that ban, crude oil would be cheaper in this country, and gasoline would probably be cheaper. But it would come at the expense of our ability to shape what's happening in Europe now, which I think is very important.
I think it's interesting to think about, who have been the United States as suppliers of imported petroleum products, for example. And back in the 70s, when we went through those initial oil shocks, a lot of it was coming from the OPEC countries. Now, if you were to look at who we import oil from, it tends to be Canada and Mexico, and of course, Saudi Arabia and Russia. But I think something for us to think about is how can we use, as we are now, our market power to forge economic relationships for critical supplies like energy resources in such a way that we source those from countries that share our fundamental values, our fundamental democratic values. And how do we avoid or shun or use our market power to make life difficult for exporters of fossil fuels who don't share those values. Because if Tom Friedman has made this point very well about the inverse relationship between democratic values and petroleum producing countries. And it's a bit of a shame, isn't it, that the United States still finds it hard to say anything too critical of Saudi Arabia. And it's a shame that the European Union has been so basically tied to their Russian source of oil and gas. And I guess I just think that's something as a nation state we need to think about long term. I think we are stronger when we are interdependent with others rather than solely independent. But I don't think that should come at the expense of our fundamental democratic values.
So let's maybe pivot just a little bit and think of energy independence a slightly different way in terms of renewables. So in the sense of independent of fossil fuels, right, which we've already kind of hinted at, and the importance of it and the resilience it provides, et cetera, and obviously the impact on the environment. As I was looking, it was interesting for me to understand, obviously renewable energies have been making great headways, right, over the last decade plus. And but what's interesting is U.S. consumption of crude oil has actually been roughly at 20 million barrels a day for the last 20 years, and that hasn't changed much. Now, obviously, our population's increased a little bit, but do you? What's your thought on how quickly we can shift away from fossil fuels, our dependency on it, when we think of transportation, et cetera, but and moving more towards wind, solar, and other emerging renewable technologies? And that's for anybody that.
Well, I think you have to think of it in the different ways that we use fossil fuels and where we can reduce that consumption. We have to look at power generation, electricity and power generation, transportation fuels, and then heating and cooling. I think we're making great strides in the power sector, obviously, with the growth of wind power. Iowa's, the second or third largest wind producing state in the country. We've made huge contribution here in this state. And solar, especially in the Southwest, California. We haven't made as many inroads into transportation fuels. Now that we look to be kind of on the cusp of changing that with the growing popularity of electric vehicles. But yeah, we're still consuming 20 million barrels a day. It's been that way for 20 years. But I would also point out that we were consuming 20 million barrels a day in 1979. And so our population and the size of our economy has doubled since then. So we've actually, found ways to conserve oil production or conserve on our oil consumption. Policies that were implemented in the 70s, fuel efficiency standards, incentives to restructure electric markets. I think there's some lessons to be learned there about how we can promote renewables, but there are a lot of ways that we can make our heating and cooling and transportation and electric sector much more efficient.
Yeah, I'll just add that key to keeping our consumption of petroleum products down to that we're keeping it stable at 20 has been corporate automotive fuel economy standards that were introduced in the 70s and really made huge improvements through the 80s and then basically stalled for 20 years or so, and now they've started to come back up. The best-selling vehicle in half the states in the United States is the Ford F-150 pickup truck, and it's far more fuel efficient today than it was in the mid-70s. But I think if you were to look at what's the best-selling vehicle in the European Union, you discover that it's not an F-150 pickup truck. And so in general, the citizens of the European Union consume about half of the energy that we do per capita. So I just think there's real opportunity in the United States to continue to discover the benefits of energy efficiency in transportation and heating and cooling and our buildings, while at the same time making this transition to the electrification of transportation, which people talk about it as though it's inevitable. I don't think it is necessarily, and I think technically it's going to be a real challenge, especially on our grid. But for those that drive electric vehicles, they're ardent advocates or evangelists about the benefits of those cars, because you get incredible performance. They're less expensive to fuel and they're less expensive to maintain. Right now, they're more expensive to buy, but as more of them are made, that transition will happen. But in the meantime, I think we definitely should be trying to be more efficient with our use of petroleum products, especially given the sort of price of them, but also the political issues associated with them.
I agree. I think fuel efficiency standards are crucial, and they were raised under Obama, and it looks like they're going to be further raised under Biden. I would also add, I think it's quite possible that the most popular car in the near future might be the Ford F-150 electric.
Yeah. The huge backlog of orders, a huge demand for that. Once supply chains come back to normal, you're going to probably see tremendous growth in EVs.
So Ben, I'd like to get back to just this idea of resiliency that you spoke of earlier, and just in terms, I know this is kind of close to you and a lot that you do here in Iowa. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you're working on, how you think that's going to impact our energy future, and just thoughts you have on that would be great.
One of the issues that Linn County has dealt with, and we will be dealing with in the future, is the proliferation of industrial scale solar. And so last month, my board approved a 750 acre industrial scale solar facility in Coggan, Iowa, that will produce roughly 100 megawatts. All of this was through voluntary contracts with participating landowners. And this 100 megawatt system will power 18,000 homes in Iowa through different rural cooperative electric cooperatives. What's really interesting about industrial scale solar and why it's become such a hot button issue is, we've been really blessed in this state to have such fertile soil. And so we believe, a lot of people believe that that ground should be used for agricultural purposes. But what we're finding with industrial scale solar is that farmers are wanting to redefine how they farm in the 21st century. And so row crops for some farmers is just not the way they see the future. And so for many farmers entering into these contracts to produce sun on their land, which also ultimately these panels also help with soil quality over the 40 years in which the panels are on their land, helps water quality, runoff issues. And so building this infrastructure to have industrial scale solar, I think can really help a lot of what Jim and Tyler have talked about, whether it's energy interdependence, if it's being more efficient with the fossil fuels that we're already producing. Having this as a tool in our toolbox in Iowa, I think is pretty critical, on top of the fact that we're also one of the largest producers of wind energy. So a lot of exciting things happening locally that hopefully can impact certainly regional markets, but if we could have any kind of global impact, that's really what my generation and other generations are really hoping for as we deal with the realities of climate change and energy and our energy use.
So this kind of gets us into the interesting, topic politically, if you will, of what is our energy future? Where do we need to put our investment? Is it, on the right, you kind of hear people championing cleaner fossil fuels, right? And the wealth that comes with them, but that you can do it in kind of a environmentally friendly way. And then on the left, stereotypically, it's wind, solar. Do you see it as a dichotomy? Do you see it as one or the other? Or do you feel as if we can still continue to, produce oil, export oil, fossil fuels, burn fossil fuels cleanly, but at the same time continue to invest in these emerging renewables? How do you see it? Can they live in harmony as we go forward?
Well, I like to talk about it as decarbonization. We need to move to reducing the carbon intensity of our economy if we're going to address climate change. I think that really means eliminating coal. And, the promises of clean coal have not really been borne out. It's hard to predict where the technology will be going. But in my view, I think natural gas really is a bridge fuel in this energy transition. It's less carbon intensive than either coal or oil. The question is, what do we do with our nuclear fleet? It's pretty difficult to build new nuclear plants without, the fourth generation technologies, which are not quite there yet. But the question is, what do we do with the existing nuclear plants? Do we find some way to keep them running, and because they're becoming less competitive with natural gas and renewables? So that's going to be something that have to pay attention to. But certainly looking for every opportunity to decarbonize our economy.
I'd say key to decarbonizing our economy is putting a price on carbon. And I'm a champion. I'm a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby and think very highly of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. I think it's the best approach to carbon pricing. But without carbon pricing, I don't think we're going to make the transition fast enough. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's become a kind of debatable subject, in Democratic Party circles, and on the left, there's some people who've moved away from a carbon tax because they find that it will be too regressive, unless you can package it in a way that's where it's revenue neutral.
Yep.
So that it doesn't harm the people who spend more of their disposable income on energy.
Yep.
So we got about 30 seconds left. I think, Ben, we're going to give you the final word to take us on in.
Oh, that's a lot of responsibility. I
right.
do want to thank Jim and Tyler, for whom they're experts in this field and can speak on the nuances. And I think that this subject should really be talked about more, because our future is at stake. Whether we're able to succeed or not, we should try everything with renewables and with sources of energy that we know can help us be a leader in the 21st century in the energy sector, while at the same time increasing our resilience.
Beautiful. Beautifully put. Thank you. So again, to all three of the panelists here, and you viewers at home, I hope you have a great Sunday. I hope you've enjoyed the show this morning. Thank you very much, and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.